Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's episode of Hocus Focus with me, your host, Thomas Sheridan.
And me, Sara Mondaini.
And this is episode number 17. We're nearly at 20 now, Sarah. And there's a real feeling of spring in the air. The show is going from strength to strength. And I think the balance of topics and things we cover and how we cover are blending in nicely. It seems to be it's getting easier to do as we get more experience doing it. And I hope you're well, Sarah, and keeping safe and sound and out of trouble.
Yeah, very well. Freezing cold over here, but doing very well. And delighted with the responses to last week's show. The comments were great. And I'm really happy that everyone enjoys it. And I'm really, really looking forward to getting into another visit to that world of high strangeness this week as well.
Fantastic. Well, the first topic this week is probably the biggest conspiracy of them all in terms of size, and that is Antarctica. That ice covered massive continent at the bottom of the southern hemisphere. In many ways, still a mysterious place even today, and not necessarily because we haven't explored it, but because there's a strange kind of prohibition on so much of it. And it always seems to have been, as long as there's been officialdom, a strange relationship between governments and the Antarctic continent itself. The first aspect of the high strangeness regarding Antarctica was the discovery or rediscovery of the Piri Reisi map found that was made by an Ottoman admiral back in the 1530s, I think it was. And it had shown not only incredible detail of the continents of North and South American coastlines, but also apparently the coastline of Antarctica, about 200 years before it had allegedly been discovered. Not only that, it showed it without ice. When the map was discovered, there was so much shock over it. It was one of these things that should have never existed. And remember, Piri Reis said the map came from a compilation of much earlier maps which he'd put together into this new map, and that made it even more strange. The U.S. Secretary of State, why, and it will be revealed as time goes on, in 1929 contacted the Turkish embassy, the U.S. embassy in Turkey, and asked them to know how the hell is there a map from 1530 with Antarctica on it. And that is the first thing in history about Antarctica, which shows there's something very peculiar going on down there in the relationship between governments and the continent. Why was he so obsessed with this? Why did he the second highest position, I believe, that is in US government, interested in this map from the 1530s simply because it had Antarctica on it? Eventually, in time, the debunkers, our friends, said that the map was misleading and that was not Antarctica on the map, but was actually the southern coast of Patagonia in Argentina. And the rationale for this was they had said you cannot see the the Passage, the shipping route between South America and Antarctica, where ships can pass from the Atlantic into the Pacific. Now, that's a ridiculous reason for saying the map couldn't show Antarctica. There could have been lots of ways they got to Antarctica without even going near the Drake Passage. They could have went straight down from South Africa or just straight down the middle of the Atlantic. So the map was buried for years and years until about the 1980s and 90s when people like Graham Hancock brought it to the fore in their own work and popularized it. But where the mysteries of Antarctica really come into their own is in the mid and late 1930s, where Hermann Goering, who was ostensibly, he was the head of the Luftwaffe in the Third Reich, but he was also, his official position was basically, it would be equivalent to the president of Germany. And he had sent down an exhibition in 1938 with the brief of photographing and cartography, making maps of an area of Antarctica. And the exhibition, because they had very good weather, had tremendous success. They photographed over 250,000 square miles of territory that hadn't been discovered, including a brand new mountain range. And they started to prepare very high detailed maps for a German base to be installed on that part of Antarctica. It was basically the very bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, you have to remember the time, Antarctica was equivalent to an alien planet. Even in the 1930s, so little was known about the interior beyond the whaling stations that ringed the circumference of the continent. The interior was very little known except for direct paths. It might as well have been an alien planet, which is probably why H.P. Lovecraft set his epic novel at the Mountains of Madness in Antarctica, because it sort of like was an alien world on this planet. So it's perfect for cosmic horror, and that went through history, movies like The Thing. But anyway, World War II broke out, and when they were told that the German expeditions to Antarctica had suddenly stopped, or did they? In the early part of the war, there's a place called Deception Island, which is in the Antarctic. It has land on it, though. The British Navy discovered vast amounts of coal and oil and other supplies that were left on Deception Island by the Argentinians, though we don't know who it was in Argentina who had left it there. And it was obviously going somewhere south. It was being picked up. They were supplying some base in the Antarctica, and Deception Island was the halfway point. Now, the British, determined to protect their interests down there in that part of the world, they sent a battleship out, and it shelled and bombed the oil and coal supplies, ruptured the tanks, to make sure whoever the hell was getting that stuff didn't get it. Now, remember, Germany officially was no longer involved in the Antarctic region because of the war. This went on till 1945, and when the war ended, all the U-boats around the Atlantic, around the world actually, were told to surrender to the nearest port. However, there is the mysterious anomaly of U-boat 530. U-boat 530 sailed into the naval base just south of Buenos Aires in Argentina. The captain of the U-boat expected a greeting, because ostensibly Argentina and Nazi Germany were allies then, de facto. When he arrived, there was great excitement among the German community. Remember, this had happened. Germany surrendered in early May 1945, and this was July, a couple of months later. The German expat communities, which were very pro Third Reich within South America, were very excited by the arrival of U-boat 530, because they thought, they had this belief that on board was Adolf Hitler, his wife Eva Braun, and Martin Bormann, who were to continue the Third Reich based out of South America rather than in Germany, which had been captured and occupied by the Allies. Turns out it wasn't that case. And the Argentinian Navy were rather amused by the whole event and didn't really understand what was going on. But the British and the Americans were very interested in this U-boat, why it had spent that extra time in the South Atlantic and what it was doing. Then things got really interesting when a U-boat called 977, in mid-August, you're talking nearly 3 months, or more than 3 months than the end of the war, shows up at the same Argentinian naval base, and the US Royal Navy and Argentinians were convinced that this thing was sequestered down in these German territories down in Antarctica. They interrogated the crews of both U-boats and then officially came to the conclusion these guys were just sailing around the sea. Makes no sense. Makes no sense at all. One rumor was that the ashes of Adolf Hitler was being brought down to Antarctica to be deposited in a very special cave. And rumors were rife in Argentina regarding this missing time of these U-boats, particularly U-boat 977, which really was a long time away and had to be somewhere else that wasn't in Argentina or South America. 3 months after the war, it surrendered. After the war ended, the Argentinian media, and this makes a lot of sense, went into a kind of an overdrive talking about there was a secret Nazi base in the Antarctic. And these articles that appeared in the Argentinian mainstream media, magazines and radio and newspapers were surprisingly in-depth, talking about how the thing was worked out and supplied and everything. And it makes a lot of sense when you go back to the appropriately named Deception Island and all the stockpiles of coal and oil that were there. So obviously people, if there was a secret Nazi base in Antarctica and was being supplied either by the Argentinian government on the sly or by private companies who were contacted, they would have been the ones to know what was really going down there. Then another rumor ensued that the Special Air Service, the SAS of the British Army, went to attack a Nazi outpost that was held in Antarctica. And they couldn't do it. They were shocked by the installation that the Nazis had built down there, how well equipped it was, how safe it was, and so on. 2 years later, Admiral Byrd, a high-ranking Scottish Rite Freemason and basically an American aristocrat, went down with 33 battleships and almost 5,000 troops to do what they called a scientific expedition. That was also the cover story used for Deception Island too by the British. It was a scientific expedition. And while they were in the area, they suddenly made a hasty retreat. Rumors abounded in the Argentinian press that Byrd and his fleet had been attacked by the Nazis using these secret wonder weapons that were supposed to be used at the end of the war to defend Berlin, but they weren't able to use them in time. But they did get them down to South America, and they built basically a Nazi colony, a military base in the Antarctic, and they'd used these wonder weapons on Byrd, and he ran away in terror, almost like a warning. It was called Operation High Jump, by the way. And then it went, more or less, that was it. The story went out there that there was a Nazi base down there. No, most people didn't believe it. They thought it was a thing of sensational or tabloid journalism in South America. And it continued on and on until in the 50s, there were 3 mysterious nuclear explosions that have never been explained down in the region. Now, whether they were used by the Allies on this secret Nazi base, if it existed, or the secret Nazi base used the weapons on the Allies to warn them off, we don't know. But ever since then, Antarctica has been a highly restricted, highly militarized zone. It's very difficult to get into most of it. It's divided up between basically Norway, Australia, Great Britain, the United States, I think bits of Canada, and they own the land. And a lot of the mapped areas are hidden. A lot of the areas on Google Maps are blurred out and the satellite images. And if you land there in any without a permit or without a visited visa, you're risking a lot of trouble. Now, there's something down there. We know it was a former continent that was covered in ice. So there's all kinds of theories regarding that there's a lost world underneath it. There's other theories that in the center is a warm ocean. And there's other theories of the entrance to the inner earth, although that's been associated with both poles. Hillary Clinton in 2009, again, when she was US Secretary of State, it seems to be happening again, wanted and implemented a treaty to stop tourists from visiting Antarctica, using the excuse of climate change and endangering ecological well-being of the continent. Now, this is ridiculous considering how vast it is and how few tourists would actually ever visit it. So to this day, and has been all the last century from 1929 on at least, Antarctica has become something of a no man's land in terms of what's going on down there, what kind of experiments are happening, and if indeed the Third Reich managed to survive down there and maybe have a secret treaty with the world powers to say, you leave us alone. It makes you wonder about things like, we'll talk about this in a minute, why you have all these Germans in positions of power of world bodies such as the WEF and so on. So, what do you think of that, Sarah?
Well, officially, the Operation High Jump, Admiral Byrd's operation was to assess, as you said, he was equipped with 8 months of supplies, and the mission was aborted after 16 weeks, and they left in a hurry with no explanation, nothing. And some speculate they may have come up against something or someone that may have been a connection or a battle between Byrd's fleet and the Nazis in the region. In fact, some have even suggested that that Byrd said to the journalists, the US needs to prepare for a fight against aircraft that can fly from pole to pole at tremendous speeds, which could indicate that he'd encountered this advanced technology when he was down there. And in 1944, the Nazis were reportedly building airframes and propulsion systems for a project that we talked about before, the Nazi Bell, at the end of the war. And at the end of the war, the SS general in charge of that project vanished without a trace, and his scientists and prototypes were captured by the US military, and they were taken to the States. And 2 years later, after that happened, the first wave of UFO sightings occurred across America, and some people suggested that they were the US prototypes of Nazi aircraft, such as the H-9 fighter wing. And then going forward in time again, in 1965, we talked about the UFO that crashed in Pennsylvania, and it was said to be bell-shaped with distinctive markings, which led some speculation that the Nazis may have produced those prototypes of flying saucers and that the US further developed them. So it could be that they took their prototypes for the saucer technology, and that's where they decided that they were going to go and develop these things. And Admiral Byrd may have stumbled across that with his fleet and didn't like what he saw or was threatened, and they had to leave quickly. And that could also coincide with the high number of US UFO sightings in the States at that time, because it was a year after the war and a year before Roswell.
Yes, and that was a battle group that Byrd had led down with Operation High Jump down. It was a task force down to Antarctica. It wasn't a few geologists going down there to look for oil and gas and coal. That was a battle group. They went down there for war, and whatever they encountered scared the bisto out of them, and they ran real fast. And that Operation High Jump has always been shrouded in secrecy. Now, the reason why the excuse why, well, it's probably the truth, why Goering sent the original expeditions down to Antarctica was to test German weapons and technology, particularly aircraft engines. Here we go again, how they would operate in extreme cold temperatures. The belief was always been that he was doing that to get them ready for Operation Barbarossa and the war in Russia. But they could have tested that stuff in Germany in winter. I mean, Germany gets ferociously cold in winter, and they were down there I think they were down there building an empire or something. The start of it. The fact that they started naming these places and giving them German names, and anyway, Byrd's attack down there with Operation High Jump, they called the area Little America. So it almost sounds like a weird kind of fight was going on. Now, the most extreme, outlandish thing you could come say is that the Nazis survived and prospered down there and are basically holding up and running, maybe even you could speculate they're holding the world to ransom down there and telling all these globalist leaders, do as we say, or else. They have these incredible weaponry that they developed in the final years of the war, and they perfected it and manufacturing it down there. And makes you wonder about, I mean, we know, but I've often written about the Prussian aristocracy that sort of seems to be in the positions of power behind all the royal families and all the like you have Prince Reinhard of the Bilderbergs, you have Klaus Schwab of the Davos bunch, you have all the others behind all the big pharmaceuticals. So many of them seem to be German. And you just wonder, and they all seem to come out of nowhere and have these remarkable power in the world. And you just wonder if they're anything to do with what's going down the Antarctica, especially when someone like and apparently Hillary Clinton went down there in 2009, and that's never been properly explained. I remember wasn't Art Bell, it was on Coast to Coast with George Noory. They had Richard Hoagland on it, and he was talking about no one anywhere in the State Department can explain or tell you why they say climate change and ecology, but why she was spending this time down there in the Antarctic. It's almost like she was having a meeting with this maybe the world's secret government is down there in where the bases were set up. And when you think about it, what a phenomenal cover story it would be for running the world out of sight and out of mind. It would be the equivalent of being on another planet.
Yeah, you're not allowed to go there. The average Joe can't just travel there on an aeroplane. You can't go. You have to be one of the elite to go there, and you have to go on your own chartered flight. And if you are found to be there and you're in unofficial land or airspace, then you face a prison term or a high fine for being there. So
Yeah,
nobody's
they
allowed to
could
go
kill you.
there. It's perfect.
Yeah, they could kill you and say it's an accident. In fact, you're only the people that do get the visit don't even get beyond the old whaling stations. It's
It's
literally you're allowed on the beach and that's it.
it's like a perfect metaphor for Dr. Evil's lair in the Austin Powers movie.
And people have to remember that it's a landmass. The ice is on top. So underneath, and it's a vast continent. It is colossal. If you see that famous picture of the Earth where they photograph Atlantis from space, the size of the thing is immense. It's filled with every kind of natural resource mineral you could ever want. It's just under the ice, but you can melt and cut through ice, no problem. It's easier to tunnel through ice than it is to tunnel just about anything else. And there could be entire cities underneath under the ice down there. In fact, it makes you wonder if that's what I'm nervous about ice melting. That if it all melted, we would see what they have built underneath it, the installations they built underneath there. And that was maybe that's the first thing I thought when I heard about Hillary Clinton was deeply concerned about ice melting in the Antarctica.
There's an interesting phenomenon down there. The blood falls. Have you read about that? The
Yes,
natural phenomenon to do with the iron oxide. So the one of the glaciers appears to be a deep red color because it's the iron oxide, I think, reacting with the oxygen. And it's been a source of fascination for scientists and visitors. When I say visitors, I mean the elite visitors, not you and me.
yeah, David Attenborough. But
The
yes,
BBC.
that just also shows you what kind of mineral resources are down there. You know, you have all these things that we go to the moon, we can mine the moon. There must be, Antarctica is bigger than the moon. It's bigger than it's well, not sorry, it's not bigger than the moon. It's bigger than Pluto, much bigger. So it's full of all the resources they want to get on the moon. They're all in Antarctica, and they're a hell of a lot easier to get to. And they don't want us thinking about Antarctica. We notice that don't think about it. Concentrate on other places. Don't think about it. And it's almost like written out of consciousness. I don't remember in school learning anything about Antarctica. Just it was a continent at the end of the world. But then it was sort of like that was the end of it. We didn't learn any more. Oh, no one lives down there. No one goes there. It's inaccessible. But some parts of it are quite warm and have warm, balmy summers, and there's parts of it that are very, habitable. The Antarctica Peninsula, which is the big long peninsula that comes out towards Argentina, and then there's a very strange archipelago, like a land bridge, very similar to the one uh, between Ramsutu, the one between Sri Lanka and India, but this one goes out and around through what they call the Falkland Island zone, and it goes through the Falkland Islands, Sandwich Islands, through South Georgia, and that also has you wondering about the Falklands War in 1982. And the Argentinians did, what did the Argentinians know, and why was the British government so willing to take an enormous risk, which could have easily failed, to go capture basically a couple of, cold, windswept islands, small ones in the South Atlantic. It's all very peculiar.
Very, and there's also a lot of conspiracy theories connected to it. Some of them are very interesting, and some of them are a bit outrageous, which is fine. But you do wonder if some of them have been put out there to keep you focused on the absurd. So you're not looking at what experiments are going on down there, what they're building, what empires they're running down there, what underground lairs and bases are down there.
Well, go right back to U-boat 530. There was a huge hype within the German communities in South America that Hitler and Eva Braun were on that. But the real story there was not U-boat 530. It was the one that was still out in the ocean, U-boat 977. That hype around the first U-boat could have been to distract attention from the second one, and may have even been deliberately fed and hyped up by South American German communities in order to keep the public consciousness off the one that was still missing and deep in the South Atlantic. So and also Deception Island, what of all the names to give it, and and then the British. What happened was it did come out eventually that the British battleship did destroy basically the stockpile of oil, coal, gas, and all the other things that were on their way to this mysterious unknown base. But it was reported in the British official dispatches as it was a scientific survey for a geological expedition to look for minerals and stuff like that. So loads of cover stories, and there's one that, remember this I said earlier on, that was to bring Hitler's ashes down to the part down there to be interned in some place. The term mentioned in the Argentinian media was that someone had said there's a very special cave down there. Now, the connotations that brings up is just incredible. Is that very special cave the entrance to the inner earth? Is that very special cave something else, that had minerals or some kind of ability to create these weapons they needed? But his ashes were put inside a lead-lined box that were placed inside a bronze sarcophagus. This is the story now, and placed inside this a very special cave.
I'm very interested in the inner earth theory.
Me too.
There's a whole civilization down there, a whole nother world with a central sun. And it's supposed to be quite euphoric down there.
I don't know about the central sun part, but go ahead.
It's supposed to be quite idyllic down there, perfect conditions and everything, and they don't want anything to do with us up here because to them, it's unimaginable how we live to them. But I do wonder, is it another civilization independent of ours, or is it the elite?
Well, there was the story of the Virillia, the coming of the power race, that even Rudolf Steiner believed it was a true story and not a fiction. And this became a big deal in Germany and in Britain in the late 1800s, that there was a super race that lived in the center of the earth called the Virillia, who had a magical power called Vril. And when the conditions were right, they would return to Earth and share this. Did they get the Virillia down this special cave? Did they attain this power? I do believe there's absolutely enormous proof of inner world civilizations. That realization came to me when I was in the hypogeme of Al Zappolini in Malta, and they take it to the end of the complex, and they say, "Oh, that's the end of it." And you look down, and there's a cave system with a river going, like an underground river going into the distance. And all over the world, there's stories of people who live under the ground, just as much as there's Atlantis stories of the civilization destroyed in sea. The thing with the inner sun sounds a bit, though it just sounds a bit difficult for me to grasp. It seems a little new agey or something.
It
And
could be not so much maybe an inner sun, but there must be a heat source there. There must be something.
the center of the
Yeah.
earth, the core, but there could also be
The core, yeah, the molten core. Yeah.
and light. Well, when you go down underground, it gets warm eventually after a certain distance. But also you'd have crystals and stuff that might emanate light. They probably could have even found ways to use phosphorescent funguses and algae and mildew as a way to light their caves up, to light their underground world up. There's all kinds of possibilities down there. But it's Antarctica just seemed to be the linchpin between, like, and so many conspiracies, like you were saying earlier on, the bell and the flying saucers and everything else. It seems to linchpin around so much.
Well, what was Hitler obsessed with? He was obsessed with creating a super race. So if there's a super race of the Vril down there, or even he was German, well, Austrian German. He will have heard of Steiner. He's probably followed him and read his work and thought, well, we're going to have a piece of that. And that's why they went over there and tried to claim some of Antarctica for Germany back in the late 1930s.
And also, the British seem to have found out very early on that were funny business was going on down there with the Germans in the 30s, because they were the ones who raced down at Deception Island. Now, it happened right after what? Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland. And we've never been told what Rudolf Hess told the British on MI5 when he was captured in Scotland. He could have told them this is what's going on down the Antarctic.
Another interesting theory just come to mind now would be if this Brill civilization is a kind of a super civilization, highly advanced, would they want anything to do with our elite? Maybe they don't want them down there. Maybe there's a bit of a war going on keeping them out.
According to the Steiner end of that theory and the other sort of like the sort of esoteric cult that surrounded it, the belief was that human beings were kind of corrupted in some way. We lacked a certain element of our spirituality and our biology that prevented us from interacting with them. So maybe something to do with our perception of the visual bandwidth or something, the five senses. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, that was I think it's the first ever science fiction novel ever written back in the 1870s, and it was an absolute sensation. It started religions and cults and everything, and it really drove much of the kind of like armament mentality of like the supernaturalism of the Third Reich and so on. And it's just an incredible story.
What was the name of the civilization that featured in H.G. Wells' novel, The Time Machine?
The above ground race were called the Eloi, and they were a kind of a vegetarian NPCs who had no intellect or intelligent, who lived in a kind of a false Garden of Eden. And there was the Morlocks under the ground who were actually farming them for food and had an industrial subterranean economy. So basically, what the protagonist in The Time Machine discovered was that the human beings who had survived into the distant future had basically been lobotomized, had their culture taken away, fed vegan diets, lived like children, had no inquisitive nature, had no real depth of personality, and they were raised as livestock to be fed to the Morlocks under the earth.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that sounds highly familiar to me.
And we'll leave it at that. So if you have any more things to say about this, is Klaus Schwab a Morlock from Antarctica? That's what Hocus Pocus is about. Antarctica, one hell of a mystery.
As you approach Mow Cop, the air thickens with a sense of ancient power. The hill rising up from the surrounding countryside is a place of mystery and enchantment, a landscape imbued with the echoes of a long forgotten past. But as you ascend the hill, you begin to sense that there is something more here, something that lies beyond the veil of time and memory. The ruins of Mow Cop Castle stand like a sentinel, guarding the secrets of this place with a silent intensity. The castle's crumbling walls and turrets seem to speak of an ancient past, a time of knights and chivalry. As you explore the wild and untamed landscape that surrounds it, you can feel the weight of history bearing down upon you, a palpable presence that seems to whisper its secrets on the wind. But do not be fooled by the apparent age of Mow Cop. Its history is complex and enigmatic. While it may appear to be an ancient ruin, it is in fact a carefully constructed folly, a testament to the whims and fancies of a bygone era. And yet, despite its relatively recent construction, there is a sense of timelessness that pervades this place, a feeling that the landscape itself holds secrets that stretch far beyond the boundaries of recorded history. It was built in 1754 by Randall Wilbraham, a local landowner, designed to resemble a ruined castle with a tower, battlements and a dungeon. It was built on top of the hill at Mow Cop, which is a prominent landmark in the area. As a Grade 2 listed building, it is now maintained by the National Trust. Before it was built, the hill was likely used for farming and grazing, and the area around Mow Cop has a long history of human habitation, with Neolithic structures nearby and evidence of settlements and agricultural activity dating back to prehistoric times. The imposing old Manor Mow is thought to be a Neolithic cairn tomb and was characterised in Dr. Plott's Staffordshire as a rude countenance of ancient veneration. In the medieval period, it was thought to be a defensive structure or lookout point on the hill, as it was strategically located on the border of Staffordshire and Cheshire. It's impossible to explore this landscape without encountering the work of one of its most famous and beloved chroniclers, the author and folklorist Alan Garner, whose novels and non-fiction works have captivated readers for decades. He was born and raised in the nearby town of Congleton and spent much of his childhood exploring the hills and valleys of this magical landscape. His deep connection to Mow Cop is evident in his writing, which is suffused with the folklore and mythology of the region. His best known works, including The Weird Stone of Brisingamen and The Moon of Gomrath, draw heavily on the ancient legends and stories that have been passed down through the generations, and capture the enchantment and mystery of the landscape in a way that is both timeless and deeply evocative. None more so than Red Shift, published in 1973 and features Mow Cop as a prominent setting. The book explores the theme of time travel and features 3 interconnected storylines set in different time periods, taking place at Mow Cop in Roman times, the 17th century and the modern day. It was also made into a film for TV. As you explore the structure at Mow Cop and delve into the hidden history of the place, you will also be following in the footsteps of Alan Garner and exploring the landscape that inspired his writing and fired his imagination. In doing so, you may discover a world of magic and mystery that stretches beyond the confines of the page, a place that seems to straddle the line between the mundane and the mystical, with a sense of otherworldliness that is both captivating and enigmatic. It's a place that is once dynamic and still, ancient and modern, mysterious and familiar. It is a place that invites exploration and contemplation, where you can lose yourself in the timeless beauty of the landscape and the stories that it holds.
And on this week's Folk Horror Cinema, we look at a movie that if it probably didn't exist and I didn't see it as a little boy, I wouldn't be the co-host of Hocus Focus. In fact, it set me off on the Fortean journey and also the Hauntology journey, well, that became later on in life, as to why I am this way and why I'm interested in these things. And it is the 1967 film Quatermass and the Pit, released in the United States under the title, I believe, of 5 Million Miles to Earth. Written by the great Nigel Neal and directed by Roy Ward Baker of Doctor Who fame. The film has a phenomenal all-star cast of James Donald, Andrew Kerr, and the impossibly sexy and gorgeous Barbara Shelley, the English Sophie Loren, as I called her. And the film is perfect. It is magnificent. I'm going to throw all the superlatives out on this one tonight, so get ready. The film is a remake of a BBC original TV drama by the same name, made in black and white. This one was made by Hammer Productions, Seven Arts, as a full feature movie to be released in the cinema. The story surrounds an extension in a place called Hobbs Lane in London of an underground railway line, and workers come across this strange object that's made of apparently a ceramic-like material that they can't cut, scratch, drill into, or do anything. The officials are called down, and the first thing they think is it's an unexploded World War II bomb. So the area is cordoned off, and our intrepid hero, one of the greatest fictional characters of all time, Quatermass, the professor, shows up with his friend to actually see what's going on down there. And immediately it becomes apparent to them that this thing is not a World War II secret weapon by the Germans that had been embedded deep in the ground. There was something else going on. Eventually, all the mud is cleared off, and it has the shape of something from another world. Around it, they find the bones of very early proto-humans, of which they speculate that that thing has been down there for probably thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years. The British Army, who are overseeing the disposal, dealing with this German weapon, laugh at it and call it preposterous. The British Home Office, at the same time, too, are somehow believing Quatermass, don't want to believe them at the same time. They actually get into the interior of the spaceship, and there's like a sacred geometry type design in one of the bulkheads, which they try everything to get in there. Eventually, a workman using a high-powered drill, which looks like a normal little home drill. It's the funniest thing. It's classic, like that Doctor Who like make do special effects on the end of like an extension arm. Tries to drill into it. This thing starts vibrating, and light comes out. It comes outside, and he has all these visions of creatures on another world eating and one another and so on. And they find inside that the thing eventually breaks, and inside that they're basically these like ants. And Quatermass and the others decide these are Martians. They had come here to Earth through a series of events. They figured this out, kind of like reading the mind and stuff, that these were the Martians who had destroyed each other on their own planet, and they genetically modified early humans, classic story, to become who we are today. In between, you have all these wonderful scenes, such as a copper saying, we never came round here when we were kids, so we always had this story. This is pure hocus pocus, by the way. This street was haunted. It was, almost like Dr. Ripper's kind of landscape. Also, this part of Barbara Shelley goes, Hobbs Lane. Funny, that's an old English word for the devil. And then they go into the church records, and it's got it all. I mean, the film has it all. It couldn't be more perfect than what Sara and I are into, what the story show stands for. Anyway, it turns out that this mind virus is released by the spaceship after a series of events that the British Army screw it up. It's always the classic story. Like you have the British in all of Nigel Neal's story. The British military are intransient. Uh, they can't change their minds. They're totally orthodox. They won't believe it's anything supernatural, and until it turns on them. And it basically gets all the NPCs in London to start killing each other. And believe me, when you see the scenes where people who could think for themselves are being killed by the NPCs in 1960s London, you will remember 2000 and years 2000 to 2022 very clearly. I can assure you. Like all great art, it never goes out of fashion. Look, Quatermass in the Pit is quite simply the most fantastic cosmic horror movie I think ever made. It has everything, especially even the 60s vibe to it. The way people look and they talk and that sort of like, it's very British but very modern. It's very cool and it has it all. And I can't say enough things about it. If you care about the subjects that we talk about on Hocus Pocus, then you've got to have a DVD copy of Quatermass in the Pit in your house. Sarah, what do you think?
I loved it. And just to reiterate the plot, yes, it's about the discovery of a mystery object buried beneath the streets of London, which they first think is an unexploded bomb from World War II. And then a group of archaeologists begin excavating it and they uncover an ancient Martian spacecraft and the remains of its crew. And as the team investigate the spacecraft and its history, they start to realize that the Martians visited Earth in the past. I think they said 50 million years ago, and influenced human evolution, creating or trying to create a race of superhumans with telekinetic powers. But when the dormant Martian technology, or as Thomas called it, the mind virus, is accidentally activated, the superhumans are awakened, leading to this terrifying confrontation between the ancient beings and modern humanity. And it's a really good mix of science fiction and horror, and it's got a really layered storyline, and the themes are quite deep. And this is what I picked up. There's hints of Nazi war propaganda and flying saucer development, because one of the military men involved in the excavation believed that it was put there by the Nazis for war propaganda and fear tactics, which hinted at the fact that the Germans were known to be building these prototypes for saucers. And it also suggested the possibility that the supernatural and religion and creation and legends about the devil were all down to this alien technology emitting from this hidden spaceship, and that some people could see and experience the supernatural while others couldn't, just like today, really. And there were also many metaphors to today, in that the Martians were conducting a massive genocide to get rid of the weak and the different, so they could create a super being. And then down here, people started to turn on each other for being perceived as different if they were naturally immune to the alien effects, a bit like today with natural immunity to both the microbes and the brainwashing. And the normies didn't like it in the film, and they don't like it now. So many of the themes are really relevant today as they were in 1967. And when I saw Barbara Shelley, I thought, Thomas fancies her. I know he does.
She helped jumpstart me into puberty. But yeah.
Yeah. It's a really good, creepy, atmospheric film. And typical Hammer, like you say, it's got everything. They even managed to get it into a church. This film goes into a church and dealings with a priest and all sorts in there. There's everything. But all roads lead back to, it's not religion, it's not the devil, it's not good versus evil, it's alien technology.
And that scene in the church is just fantastic, where the old vicar gets the archives out and he goes, in the location of hubs, whatever it was called back then, devils were afoot, and the layers of supernaturalism, myth, ghosts, devils, and stuff. You and I are involved in a side project at the moment, and I'll just say, we won't tell what it is, but we're talking about the town that you grew up in, Hyde, and you were talking about how it was the horrors of the present were all reflected in the layers that went right back to the folklore of the original farming community that was there. And that's what this film had a lot about that in it too as well. That the spaceship represented the darkness of the community and the city of London and maybe the world coming to the surface. Like you said, they'd mentioned, I mean, it had the Nazi war propaganda machine that was, on the surface, that was quite a plausible thing the brigadier, whoever he was, came up with to say it is a propaganda weapon left by the Germans, blah, 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 blah. That wasn't a, but I love the character of the British civil servant from the Home Office. He was a tortured soul. He's the kind of guy I wish was a civil servant because he knew what the hell was going on, but he was trying to protect the population and he was trying to try and balance everybody. You compare him to like someone that they have in England, like Matt Hancock. That was like, this guy's what a civil servant should be, the guy that played it in Quatermass, someone who's actually trying to help, everybody and make this thing somehow get out of this mess. I loved it. I love that. I mean, that scene of the copper in the house and he afraid of the building.
Yeah.
That was a really affected me as a kid because it later on in life it made me understand how to write ghost stories and horror stories and create this atmospheric, this ambiance of terror, but it's nothing. It's just a ruined house and some man's, and also the way he was shaking in there was also, it remind like I was later on in life I was watching that and saying he would also be like a man who had been molested in that house as a boy, like a pedophilia thing or something, and he was brought back there, and that's the reaction the copper would have. I just, what can you say? I mean, it's one of these things that you delighted the art of cinema, and also Arthur, I think his name was Arthur Grant, was the cinematographer. He did a phenomenal job. It had beautiful, rich colors. And the scene at the end where they confront the final evil on the building site crane it's just so original. Then it brings magic into it, the iron and the grounding and all that kind of thing. The film has it all. I mean, what can you say? It got everything there but a cherry on the top.
Yeah, it was great. I enjoyed it. It's one of those you could watch over and over. It's probably very layered as well. You'll discover something else when you watch it again because it's full of stuff.
So Quatermass and the Pit. Now, next week's film is, and we've already given you a pre-warning because it's so long, and I hope you already start watching. It's all over the place. It's easy to find. Stephen King's movie made into a TV series called Salem's Lot with David Soul and James Mason. Another masterpiece, and another one that affected me as a kid because I can remember when the first episode broadcast, the first hour of this miniseries broadcast in school the next day. Every kid in the school was saying, "Did you see that thing last night with David Soul?" So again, it just goes to show you, Sarah, how these things affect us as kids and set us off on a path in life.
Yeah.
And a good one too.
It'll be good to watch again just to see if it has the same effect on us as it did back then.
I watched the first one last night and it was just as scary as ever. And again, new depth came up.
Our second topic tonight takes us back to May 1973 in Sandown in the Isle of Wight in the UK, where two children were playing by a lake and they heard a sound that sounded like an ambulance siren and decided to investigate. As they crossed a footbridge over a stream, they stumbled upon a strange being that has been named as the Sandown Clown. And despite its odd appearance, the Sandown Clown was quite shy and friendly, and he spoke very kindly to the children for nearly half an hour before they had to go. The Sandown Clown was over 6 feet tall. However, its perfectly spherical head was described as being too large for its thin body, and it had paper white skin with a strange texture. The clown figure had 3 digits on each hand, and it wore blue gloves. Its feet also had 3 toes, and the face appeared to have been painted onto the surface of its head with blue triangles for eyes, a flat brown rectangle for a nose, and thin yellow lips shaped like an oval that didn't move when it spoke or ate. It puts me in mind of the test card, the clown, with the little girl playing the noughts and crosses. which we have over here in the UK and Ireland. This clown thing had red hair and 2 wooden antennae on the sides of its head. It was wearing a clown costume consisting of a tall pointed hat with a black knob or bobble at the top and a high-collared suit of red and green. The creature carried a microphone through which it spoke, and it had a metal shed in the woodland area near the lake. And inside this metal shed, it had blue and green dial patterns on the walls and metallic floors. And the shed also contained rough wooden furniture, which was described as being similar to a table and a set of chairs. The being said it was frightened of humans and that it wouldn't defend itself if it was attacked. It also said it drank the water from the stream and gathered wild berries, which it ate in front of the children in a very odd manner, by thrusting its head forward and moving the berries back and forth between its eyes and then down to its mouth. It could write in English using a pencil and paper, and when asked its name, it simply responded that it was Sam, and it was all colours. When asked if it was human, it said no. When asked if it was a ghost, it said, well, not really, but I am in a sort of way, and there are more of us. All the other questions about its identity were answered solely with, you know the answer. And several weeks after meeting Sam, the young girl told her father, who immediately got in touch with the British UFO Research Association, Bufora. And the reason Bufora got involved with this case was because several years prior to the children's encounter with the clown, the girl's father had had an encounter with a UFO on the other side of the island. The children reported nothing alluding to a possible child abduction situation. And if that was ever suspected, then the father would have been more likely to have gotten in touch with the local police rather than a UFO research organisation. So the strange encounter with the Sandown Clown remains a mystery. Some say it was an extraterrestrial or an apparition or even an abduction attempt, but the lack of evidence makes it difficult to draw any conclusions. But the only official investigation that was ever conducted was by a UFO research organisation, and they concluded that the children were telling the truth. So, what do you think about that?
Does anyone ever follow up the story to meet the kids as adults and ask them about it or anything like that? Are you aware of anything like that?
I had a look, and nobody can find the identity of these children or who they were. No, and the Bufora won't give out any information of any people that send reports into it. So we don't know if the children are still alive or who they are.
When I first heard about it, I was thinking it's probably a pervert of some kind. That's your first, I guess, reaction you think of. Or someone like a serial killer like John Wayne Gacy dressing up as a clown and getting young boys. But these kids either saw this happen as it was, or they had incredible imaginations which are hard to actually even comprehend. And kids can have amazing imaginations. The whole thing, if I was to pin it on one thing, assuming it wasn't a disturbed individual trying to mess with 2 kids, I'd put it into the fairy category of things that were in the domain of a kind of a fairy experience that has resolved itself into this, like you said, the test card thing from the BBC, that a way the kids could understand it. We've seen this all through history, that these entities resolve themselves into things you can understand, you can comprehend roughly, but they don't always get it right. So it may have resolved itself into this kind of thing. The fact that it appeared with the siren sound was another one that made me think, well, maybe something dodgy went on here outside supernaturalism. That the kids were having some kind of flash memory or screen memory of some terrible event that happened to them. I don't. There's no story I can think like of it in anywhere in Forteana that's comparable to its strangeness and to its just sheer weirdness and the concept. He had two wooden horns, I believe, or two wooden antennae, didn't he? And is painted on face and his strange suit and a strange little house in the woods. It just that's if I was to put my money on something, I would say it was an unknown form of fairy event.
Yeah, I was fascinated by how friendly it was to them, and when I was reading about the story, I got in my mind. I don't know if you had them in Ireland. The Charlie Says public information adverts. Do
Yeah,
you remember those?
I have seen them. Yeah, the pussycat and Charlie Says, and the little boy talking to his pussycat. His pussycat warns the kids about playing with electricity and things like that. Yeah, I have seen them.
Yeah, I got that vibe from it, because it was 1973 and those public service announcements were out then and they were so innocent. And this story just sounded so innocent. And they were kids and they were talking to a strange thing that thankfully was very friendly and very kind and could only speak to them through this microphone.
And that's weird as well. And also the way he said he was a kind of a ghost and were more like him.
Yeah, he said, not really, well, kind of, and there's more like us.
Yeah.
Is he interdimensional? I don't know.
Also, the Isle of Wight, I don't know anything about it. I've never been there, but it sounds, it's the way everywhere has its own kind of fairy folklore. That could be that one emerging in the 70s as a kind of an amalgamation of existing fairy folklore coupled with those things on children's television like you spoke about. Like there's a weird British sci-fi TV show about a little boy who comes to Earth in the early 1970s and he appears in a quarry gravel. And it's the creepiest, weirdest. This is the weirdest shit that was on television back then, especially these public service things. And there was all kinds of other strange TV shows that kids were shown. The BBC seemed to have had a real ability to create surreal television back then for kids. And you wonder if all these things were put into their head and this, whatever force is behind the men in black, thought that it would have to appear like this to communicate with children to be, what's the word, plausible.
Yeah. It's got a spooky element to me, this story, mainly because it's the 1970s. And for me, the 1970s was when we watched films like Quatermass and The Pit and those kinds of hauntology films, and you start getting an interest in this sort of stuff. So I always see the 70s for me as quite a spooky time looking back because of what was on the TV, the books I was reading, experiences I'd had, strange things. And then as we've gone and we've got older and we've looked back, we found that actually the 1970s was quite a dark time around the television and the BBC with what was going. I mean, I won't mention it because I don't want to risk getting the video
and
flagged.
all the
we know what was going on at the BBC.
And all the
what
terrorism that was going on, and it was terrible social issues. In America, the 70s is considered a wonderful time, but they were a dark, horrible time in Europe, particularly on these islands. As the sort of children's television show used to be pure shows were pure escapism in the extreme. There was one show in Ireland on Irish TV called Wanderly Wagon, which the opening sequence was this like kind of like gypsies, because gypsies covered wagon with all these puppets and characters on it, and they go through a dolmen, and when they go through the dolmen, they encounter all the Celtic gods in a magical world, and it's like, my God, you'd never see anything like that on television today, and they enter into sort of sub-reality. And there was so many shows on kid shows in the UK like that, the Tomorrow People, Children of the Stones. The list was just endless, just completely endless. And they all had these weird strangeness about them. That was the escapism from the nastiness of the real world. I remember the 70s. Well, I was only a little kid though at the time, so I was like still I was like 16 when it ended or something. So with most of me as a little kid, but I remember it being a very violent time. Lots of the fighting was very common, and getting beaten up was very common. That working class society in Dublin anyway was horrible. You know, it was like it was nasty. You know, it was like violence was very prevalent, and alcohol, not so much alcoholism, but like violence of that kind. And then you have terrorism and the IRA blowing up everything and all the sectarian stuff. So the television was the natural conduit for escapism. Another thing about the Isle of Wight is that it's a huge Freemasonic place. I don't know if that would have anything to do with it, but I'm just linking that back to the Fatima events in Portugal, which we know the Freemasons were heavily involved in reinventing that story, you know.
Yeah, the 70s for me, it's just a lot of spooky television, and watching them as a young girl, obviously they put a lot of memories in your mind. So that's why that time is quite an eerie time for me, because there was so much science fiction, so much horror, so much weird kids TV programs. You had the Hammer. The Hammer was really big in the 70s, and the Hammer TV show as well. I think we reviewed one of them on the earlier episodes. Sapphire and Steel, they all
It was
the
golden age of Doctor Who.
At Doctor Who and the monsters in that. Yeah. So when I think about Fortean or supernatural events in the 70s, they kind of amplified for me because it brings back memories of all those programs I used to watch. It's like when we talk about the 90s, I look back at the Fortean things in the 90s with a sense of nostalgia because of all those fantastic Fortean fun sort of programs about the weird stuff. But in the 70s, it wasn't so much fun, it was heavy.
Yeah. I have a very strong memory of being a young kid. My father watching, we used to get UK TV from Northern Ireland. It would beam across the border. And so we used to watch a show called World in Action, which is a fair show that started with this organ music. And it's a fantastic piece of music, actually. But then the show would be about horrors, the start, you know, who'd been killed that day and what terrorism was going down. And I always associated, I think it was on Tuesday nights or something, the dark, miserable winter evening with that music and the organ kicking in, and it speeds up. The arpeggios get faster and faster as it comes towards the end. And yeah, I mean, I, I have not a lot of happy memories from the 70s, but I have fantastic recall of stuff from the 70s. You know what I'm saying? Like the extraneous things outside daily life are fantastic, but daily life itself was crap.
Yeah, the 70s, it's books and TV and comics and everything probably shaped into what we're doing now. But it started there for me as a child. So some of those books and comics and TV programs as a young girl, they had quite an impact on me, you know, quite frightening, not in a bad way, but I can, you know, it's like Christopher Lee as Dracula. It's quite good to watch now, but as a young girl, that was quite an iconic thing to see. And the vampire in Salem's Lot coming up to the window, and those things have quite an impact. So yeah, so the 70s for me is quite spooky for that reason. And living in a haunted house as well didn't kind of put another layer on top of it as well. So when I read that story about the children seeing that clown, it kind of brought other nostalgia and memories back for myself. So it added another layer of weirdness to it. It's hard to explain.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. In fact, the more you speak about that right now, the more I'm agreeing with you. It's almost like a nostalgia demon or something that was only to resolve itself all these decades later when people like us are talking about it, which is a phenomenal Fortean kind of concept if you were to actually think of that as well. That it was the Fortean of the past was like a seed to be planted at. Well, you know, the world is a strange place. as a 40 resolution in the future. That's a very interesting idea. You've definitely got my gears running on that one now.
Everything for a reason.
Yeah.
You know, all that spooky stuff. And even if it, as a young boy or a young girl, even if it terrified you and it played on your mind and gave you nightmares, it was for the greater good, because now you can use all that to kind of navigate through what's happening now and help other people to see beyond the everyday mundane shite, really.
And when that wave function collapsed, I went into the 80s, and it became, my life was a dream. Like moving to America as a young lad and living that kind of like the kind of life in that kind of world that was a magical and so much different than what had come from. And yeah, that was a wave function, that whole 70s darkness that we grew up in on these islands that had to be collapsed. And when it collapsed, it gave us the kind of consciousness we have now. I think that's it. I think that's, yeah. I mean, even when I think back, the people it steered me towards, even in music and art and everything else, it was always from that early childhood. Going back, I remember the BBC on a Saturday night used to show 2 horror films starting at 10 and ending at 1 a.m. or something. Do you remember that? Are you old enough to remember the 2 late night BBC films? And that's where I first got my introduction to all the things like Hammer, and I think I first saw Barbara Shelley on Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and it's just a fantastic memory.
Yeah, we used to get it on a Friday night on BBC Two, a double bill, usually a Hammer double bill.
Maybe
and I do remember, yeah, I remember one of them was the Horror Express, I think it was called, about Rasputin the monk being transported across on a Trans-Siberian train. It was Christopher Lee.
I think
It's all coming back now.
Telly,
the red
Telly Savalas played a Cossack, Kojak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful to my parents for letting me watch that at such a young age, because it's kind of shaped me into who I am today. So I'm grateful that I was exposed to that. And
Cool. Yeah.
when you get into the 80s and you get a little bit older, it was almost like somebody had turned up the color and the volume, and everything became modern
And warm.
Yes, and the music changed completely, the TV programs changed completely, films, and then it got a little bit cheesy in the middle.
Yeah.
And then it settled down and we went into the 90s, and yeah, still quite colourful in the 90s. And Forteana was a lot more mainstream and accepted in the 90s.
Well, then we got the X-Files shows like Sightings and 40 and TV and what was Unsolved Mysteries, and all these other shows appeared.
Yes.
That they were aimed at people like us who grew up with that stuff as kids.
And then I think after 2001, after the event in 2001, kind of all went away and it became weird again. Nobody was interested because people were more focused on the TV news and what was coming next.
Well,
the magic went away.
I got a message today from a lady who said that watching Hocus Pocus brings her right back to the feeling that she feels right back to pre-2001, which I was very proud to hear.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, I mean, mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. So that was the reason for the clown in the Isle of Wight. You know, it sort of was so strange that you couldn't demarcate it in the confines of just a normal 40 and mysterious event, that it forced us, me and you and other people, to ask questions about our own existence and our own cultural upbringing that brought us to this point. And maybe that was the reason for the Sandown Clown. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I do think there's more to it than just a child's imagination, most definitely. And wherever he is, I hope he's doing all right, because he was very friendly and he was very polite and he was very nice to those children. So If anybody's got any idea or know anything more about the Sandown Clown or the whereabouts of the children that were involved, please put it in the comments, because we'd be very interested to know a bit more about it, because it's impossible to draw any conclusions or to see where it went from the initial reporting to the British UFO Association. They won't release any details about the report on or who the names were or where they are now. Especially
if you live in the Isle of Wight or have lived there. You know, lives there. David Icke lives there.
He does, yeah, he does. Has he covered it? I don't know. I'll have a look. I didn't come across it when I was researching it.
No, but I don't know either. I have no idea. I'm sure he's heard of it. And without any aplomb, here is Sara with the psychic hygiene tips.
Do you feel like you need to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and just want to immerse yourself in nature? I know I do. There's something magical about spending time outdoors that can be so soothing. Not only can it help you clear your mind, but it can also release stress and anxiety and recharge your energy and even spark creativity. To use nature for psychic hygiene, it's all about finding a peaceful spot where you can be truly present in the moment. Maybe you like to go for a hike, or perhaps you prefer to find a cozy spot in a local park, or just chill outside on a wall and soak up some sunshine. Whatever your preference, make sure it's a place where you can fully connect with nature and the world around you. Once you've found a spot, take a few deep breaths and allow yourself to take in all the sights, sounds, and smells of the natural world around you. Inhale the fresh air and the sweet scents of the plants and the flowers and the trees. Listen to the wind rustling through the trees, or the sweet songs of the birds singing. Feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, or the coolness on the earth beneath you. It's a time to know that you're connected and a part of all this beauty. Despite the trials and tribulations of the day, nature is always there to welcome you with open arms. So as you sink deeper into your natural surroundings, let go of any worries or distractions that might be weighing you down. Take a moment to set an intention or focus your time in nature, whether it's to release negativity, energy, or emotions. Simply feel a sense of peace and rejuvenation. By making a regular practice of connecting with nature for psychic hygiene, you'll be tapping into the natural rhythms of the energies of the earth and promoting a greater sense of balance and well-being. It's a great way to clear your mind of all those chattering thoughts and distractions that can sometimes get in the way. And the best part, the trees and the creatures around you will listen without judgment, allowing you to truly be yourself and let go of any stress or tension you may be carrying. So go ahead and nature bathe till your heart's content. And that's my psychic hygiene suggestion for this week.
Well, I can't say add any more to that, except when I like to do it, my favorite time to do it is in a summer's morning at about 4 a.m. when the sun is up here in this part of Ireland. It's light, and there's often a mist around from the dew, and it's incredibly silent. And I go for a walk in the countryside, and it's just me and the bats. And the animals, the wild animals, but lots of bats. And yeah, I mean, that's such an important one. That's it. Communion with nature is the ultimate, I think.
Yeah, and it's free, it doesn't cost anything, just a little bit of time.
Yeah, and even walking on a full moon night in the countryside, if it's a safe place to walk, can be fantastic as well. And you have there was a group in England called the Ancients, back in the early 1800s. So the painter Samuel Palmer was one of them. They were part of the Romantic movement. And they used to do is wander in the countryside at night, and he'd produce these beautiful watercolors of, like, when farmers used to use the full moon to keep working because it was a light source. And I can't, I can't add really any more to what you said then. Yeah. And this topic for tonight, well, my interest goes back to it, finding out about it in the June 1996 edition of 14 Times, which I still have. Never throw away your 14 Times, ever. Or your copy, if you live in America, your copy of Fate magazine. Anyway, inside this was an article called "It's All Right, We're from the Social." And it discussed a phenomenon that was being reported all across the UK and also in Ireland, and interestingly enough in Newfoundland in Canada, and that was the phenomenon of bogus social workers. The earliest reports were happened in Scotland, and they started appearing in towns all across England. And the story was usually of a man and a woman dressed in a formal suit, sometimes a woman on their own, and they would say, "We are here from such and such department or agency regarding child welfare," or something similar. "We want to come inside and see your children." They had strange mannerisms about them. They didn't look right. They didn't seem right. And most importantly of all, they frightened the people who answered the door, very similar to the black-eyed children phenomenon. Usually it was a woman at home and her husband was at work, or a childminder was looking after her children on behalf of the mother who might be shopping or something like that. It was always in the day. They often had a card that didn't look right. It would say child protection or child safety. And they were very intimidating. There was an intimidating nature about them. And people were genuinely frightened by them. Reports started getting back to local police services all over the UK, and you began to investigate them as a possible child abduction ring. The police in various constituencies all said the same thing. They are not child abductors, but they are real. They've never been identified. They've never been found out. There's no photographs or videos of them, unfortunately, that have ever been taken, but there are identikit pictures which people who encountered them described them as what they look like. The bogus social worker phenomena lasted for a long time, from the mid-1990s, in terms of its main event of being promoted and talked about, up until well into the 2000s. So at least a decade. Among my own thinking, it is a Men in Black variant, whatever the Men in Black is, and why it came about and what it relates to, that's the million-dollar question. But the bogus social worker phenomena is one of the most widely reported and investigated 14 events of recent decades. So it's not just been one or two people, there has been hundreds of people who come to the police about it. So there's definitely something to it. So what do you think of that, Sarah?
I think it's really, really odd. And it's unclear if these people just want to frighten the families or if they've got an intention of actually stealing the children. And sometimes not only do they claim to be social workers, but they claim to be health workers, health visitors, and have even been known on occasion to examine the child with an attempt to take the child away sometimes. But an abduction attempt only happens occasionally, which makes you wonder, is that because the opportunity hasn't arisen, or is that because there's something about the child that isn't suitable for what they're doing? And there's been thousands and thousands of police hours and hundreds of thousands of pounds of public money been put into investigating it, and nobody's ever been arrested, not one single arrest. And the visitors, they just seem to vanish into thin air. And it's just a mystery. Is there an undercover operation going on with the press? Are the press playing it down to stop mass panic, or was there an actual blackout from reporting what was behind it all? A lot of the reports, I believe, were dismissed as nothing more than cries for help from the distraught parents, which is a really small-minded way to conclude something. If it is a case of modern-day fairy abduction, then no, the police aren't going to solve it, and the criminologists and the psychiatrists aren't going to come to the correct conclusion, especially if they continue to blame the victims when something is an anomaly that they don't understand. And social work's a profession that's organised in a highly mainstream way, and it operates as what governments class as, or it operates in a way that governments class as societal norms, and it's up there with the medical profession and other caring professions and public sector bodies for not wanting to consider or not being allowed to consider alternative ways of looking at things. And if people do report strange occurrences like that, which can't be explained, then the default bureaucratic way of handling it is to say that the person who reported it must be imagining things or need help. And I think that's really quite offensive to the poor, distraught women who've had these things knocking at the door, wanting to come in, wanting to be invited in. And it's like the black-eyed children. Is there a need to be invited across the threshold before they can come in? Is it some kind of vampiric entity? I don't know. Is it possible that if they are supernatural entities, are they deriving pleasure or sustenance from the fear and anxiety that's being created from the families that are being visited? It's horrendous. I mean, to think, you're in your own home and a complete stranger knocks at the door and says there's been reports of the child crying, for example, and people have informed social services, or there's been reports that you've been beating your child up, or you've been abusing your children. Can we come in and have a look? And you're not doing anything of the sort. And these people aren't even from the bloody social services. It's horrific. It's horrible.
There's two ways of looking at this. There's the conspiratorial way, and then there's the Fortean way. Although we know in this field they sometimes bleed into each other. But let's look at the conspiratorial element of it, or rationalization of it. It happened on the tail end of that awful satanic panic where working class communities were terrorized by social workers and the courts and the police with bogus stories of mass child sexual abuse and sacrifice to devil and Satan. That's all turned out to be absolute bullshit. There was nothing to it. It was a way for social workers to target working class communities. Often these social workers were women of a certain ilk and of a certain sexual bend, shall we say. And they seemed to have it in for poor working class families. And they caused mayhem all over the United States, Canada, and England and Scotland with these horrific bullshit cases surrounding satanic panic. It happened on the end of that. It was almost like, and the name of social workers was at an all-time low. They seemed to be no good at protecting children that needed protection, and seemed to be very good at damaging families who were good to their children, and picking, and it was a class-based thing, picking on the working class ones, particularly single mothers. And so therefore, okay, was it some kind of psychological operation run by the government to mess with people, to do things, where these government agents? That's one way of looking at it. How does it tie into the child abduction thing that we know happened surrounding the likes of Cyril Smith and Jimmy Savile and all that stuff? We can go there. We go to the Fortean thing, that it's some kind of fairy phenomenon that's resolved itself in a modern sense, that or an entity of some kind that gets, as you said, garnishes energy and food from the terror that it incites into the poor people whose doors they knock on. That's another way of looking at it. The same definitely seems to be something to that with the black-eyed children, these bogus social workers, and the men in black, the MIBs. Then you could have a crossover thing of both of them, where in the wake of the satanic panic and the dislike of social workers and how they behaved in the 80s and early 90s, that it transformed into a kind of what they call a tulpa, a thought generated form, where evil was personified by these entities that created it by these. It was always working class communities, by the way, which is very interesting. They're usually the ones picked on by social workers anyway. I mean, people in middle class and wealthier communities, they can do anything they want to their kids. The social worker won't knock on the door. A working class person, their kid can have a bruise on their finger, and the next thing they're knocking down the door with a court order. So we have to bear this in mind. There's also the possibility that they are some kind of, I don't know, demon or entity or alien or some shit like that. I don't know. But what do they all have in common? They harvest the terror, right? So that terror is released for a reason. And they seem to go away satisfied with the terror being enough. They arrive and they appear out of nowhere as if they manifested on the spot and disappeared on the spot. They have an implausible human persona. Well, we know that from other things as well. This is the Men in Black. I was recently watching an interview with a guy called Tom O'Neill who wrote a book on MK Ultra, and he described just how evil MK Ultra was in terms of the things they did to people. So we must never forget or put it past, because although this is a Fortean show, a true Fortean also indulges conspiracy. We should never put it past governments to do incredibly wicked things that are outside the realm of convention in terms of studying or messing with people or, wrecking their heads, that it could have been something like that as well. But it absolutely happened. There's no doubt about it. And the most disturbing thing that I find most about the bogus social worker thing is that I can't figure out what it is. Enough for me to say it could be this. Everything I throw into this conversation is out of desperation rather than, working towards a hypothesis.
If it was of human source, if it was what you said, some kind of conspiratorial thing with the government's messing with the heads of the working class by trying to frighten them, some kind of, I don't know, social experiment with psychological terror turning up at the door and threatening to take the kids, you would think that with all the hundreds of thousands of pounds that went into the investigation and all the man hours that were put in with the police, somebody would have been arrested, even if it was a patsy, even if it was just something to calm the public down, unless it goes a lot higher up and it's a big cover-up and the police know who's what group of people are doing it, and the media report what they're told to report by the higher ups. So that kind of answers that question. But it doesn't feel like that to me. It's weird. It's just weird. It's just weird. If it was human, there would have been a patsy arrested, a fall guy. Somebody would have took the rap for this to wrap it up and put it to bed, even if they didn't do it. Do you know what I mean?
But nobody was ever arrested or pulled in for MK Ultra in the USA. That only came out in a congressional hearing. They had no idea it was going on, even though so many individuals were involved in it. Could we be talking about a long-term psychological operation against the British working class, the English working class in particular? Let's look at this history. Who did Moira Hindley and Ian Brady murder? Well, let's go right back to Jack the Ripper. Who did Jack the Ripper, or what Jack the Ripper was? Who did they go after and terrorize? Working poor people on the margins of society. Who did Moira Hindley and Ian Brady target? Poor people on the margins of society. Who did the Yorkshire Ripper terrorize, and government propaganda around it terrorize, including playing the warnings about them in pubs and nightclubs and everything else? Working class people on the margins of the community. The same with Dr. Shipman in Hyde. Who did he kill? Working class old ladies. And then this thing, and then the satanic panic. They all seem to be aimed at the same demographics in society, and they only seem to happen mainly in England. Is it some kind of ongoing version of MK Ultra aimed at the English British working class? This thing opens up so many questions. It just then you ever get anywhere near resolutions to it.
So if we look into from the bogus social workers of the 90s, if we look from then to now, have we had anything?
Well, they didn't need it because they had the war on terror. So you had terrorism was the all-encompassing thing. It was like after 9/11, everything became terrorism. And okay, I'll throw one mix into it, even though it's a real terrorist event, the Manchester Arena bombing. It's just so. It just seems to be that these things that I've just mentioned in the run up to this never happened in Cheltenham and nice neighborhoods, never happened in the Cotswolds, never happened in nice areas of the home counties, but they happen in the poor working class towns. There has to be a reason for this. If it's not conspiratorial, then it's psychic or something, or maybe both.
Yes, like the high stress and anxiety situations of life on the breadline kind of creates a psychic charge of negativity that feeds like a tulpa, a thought form.
How many middle class families have poltergeists? They always seem to be in council estates. That's just another one.
Unless it's a Dennis Wheatley novel. but yes.
But then they've been summoned forth during a godless ritual.
But no, you're right. It's the council estates and the working class areas and the 2 up, 2 down rows and rows of terraced houses in the mill towns.
Well, that's why when I go to England and visit these towns, and there's still lots of them, like you might be like Nelson in Lancashire or Burnley or parts of Yorkshire and stuff like Wakefield. I get a very strong mystical vibe that I feel like I'm in the same world that people in rural Ireland lived in when fairies were a strong belief or something. I can't explain it, but when I go to those mill towns in England, especially in Lancashire and Yorkshire, there's just something there that I can't explain. That it's like they're haunted. They truly are haunted landscapes. The fact that they're like heavily urbanized, densely populated, towns in between often very remote rural areas with the moors and so on, just adds to that as well. And I don't know. This is the whole thing. It's like if you look at people who are most likely to ridicule the paranormal, they tend to come from comfortable middle class families that never really had to worry about anything in their lives. Where if you meet people with a genuine interest in the paranormal, they tend to come from places like Hyde, where you're from, Ardesley, and Ballymun, where I'm from. I find that very interesting. I don't know why, but I do. And it seems to affect us deeper and more. I don't know why. And so whatever the key to that is probably also the key to the bogus social workers.
Maybe I've thought about that myself, and maybe it's because people like, I don't like saying people like us, but people who come from areas like we do, maybe some of us, our nervous systems are more finely attuned to the environment that we've grown up in. So we pick up on the layers and layers and layers of what's gone on in the past. And then in the name of redevelopment, the councils and whoever's in charge, they flatten it down and they build over it again, basically just putting a plaster over it. It might get rid of the old slums and the old social problems, and it puts up nice new fancy houses, but it doesn't clear the psychic landscape that was there. And then everything's all right for a while, few years, 10 years, 20 years, and then it starts up again.
I think that's
it's always there.
I think that's a very good point. And, will we experience something? I've been keeping my eyes open in the wake of the scamdemic and what's, the lockdown, to see if there has been any kind of new emerging hauntology appearing out of it. The new version of the bogus social workers. I'm, now that the middle classes have been directly affected because they've gotten the needlecraft too, they can't escape. I'm wondering now if we will have the ghosts of the needlecraft. I mean literal ghosts. I mean the hauntological Fortean experiences manifesting into something different. I'm really, because they were not just like World War II. I was just looking at the magical Battle of Great Britain there the other day by Dion Fortune. We're not going to get out of this experience with just bread and butter and nuts and bolts. There's going to have to be something else in there, and there will be manifest from it. And I think the bogus social workers are something like that. But what the hell they are, I haven't a clue.
With the working class, not the work, excuse me, with the middle class now, with what's going on, with what's happened in the last couple of years with the needlecraft, there's going to be so much loss and heartache and confusion and sadness with what's coming down the road because of what they've done to themselves. That's going to create so much anxiety and negativity that might just breed a whole new load of poltergeist activity, supernatural activity, tulpas. It's going to be like a Belisha beacon for anything that wants to feed off negativity that's floating around. It's hard to put into words.
Yeah, I know. There's weird social phenomena is already starting. I was talking to some friends on the weekend, and I mentioned on my social media today, I've never seen so many people getting tattooed. Women in their 60s who never had a tattoo in their life are getting these things up their neck and piercings, and they're all, what are they all? They've all been transubstantiated. And, they've developed a kind of a relationship with the needle. It's almost like they're subconsciously trying to be somebody else at some kind of cosmic level by painting their skin or something. And I mentioned that on my social media today, and everyone said you're absolutely right. They're all over. Everyone, all the normies I know who are trans are all suddenly, if they had tattoos, are now covering themselves in new ones. And there's in the town, the main town not far from here, they've already had a couple of tattoo shops, and more have opened. They can't keep up with the demand. So that's the beginning of the kind of hauntological aftershock has already begun with the tattoos. And I have friends who are tattoo artists. I'm going to ask them what kind of patterns they're constantly asked for or whatever. And, but it is weird. We're already experiencing the sort of like the psychic breakdown at this level. The next level is we hit the subconscious level that will manifest in the phantoms of the needlecraft. I'm absolutely convinced of it. That's coming next.
Well, if it's anything like the calamari that's turning up inside the
Mother hide babies, yeah.
Yes, on the inside of a body, then I do not know what is going to manifest on the outside of on the flip side of that. All I do know is whatever it is, I won't be standing in its way.
No,
because it's nothing to do with me.
No, I saw a Satanist read a post by a Satanist back in 2020 and said don't even dare to try and stop this force. If it's that powerful that humans are sacrificing themselves to it in their tens of millions, stay out of it. Observe, catalog, look at it, but stay the hell out of its way. Don't try to stop it or anything, because it's like it's a cosmic force we've never seen before. Oh, absolutely, yeah, 100%. That's why when the early days of the whole thing starting, I was constantly diving into the Lovecraft stories. I could not, and the way out was the Tolkien stories. It was I could not rationalize it any other way. And I think everything that goes on, it's funny, we're going back to the Sandown Clown thing, is a projection, a telepathic outcasting of the tormented zeitgeist at some level.
Yes.
And maybe that's the way we start to look at the bogus social workers. Have you anything more to add to that?
Yeah, but I can't put it into words. I need to sort my thoughts out on that. I might
Well,
off the record.
we could always come
Put it
back.
in the book.
We could always come back in a few months' time to this topic again.
It's got me thinking. It's got me thinking a few things like
We have that time
the,
anyway.
the spiritual force that's swept through this planet
Yeah.
has probably left pockets of psychic energy that's going to manifest all kinds of phenomena. Forget about fancy radars, satellites, and weather balloons. We've got the man who doesn't need any of that to predict the forecast. He's got the power of the universe on his side with his profound insight into cosmic chaos. Let's go over now to the one and only Thomas Sheridan for this week's psychic weather.
Well, thank you for that eloquent introduction, Sarah. Perhaps I just have a better intuition. I don't know, an advanced intuition. Yeah, sadness. I'm detecting a lot of sadness and sort of like a collective weeping at the moment. Not anything traumatic that like people are falling apart, but what I do is I watch social media very carefully, and my day job, the few days a week I work, or I deal with the public, so I'm in a perfect position to do these reports. I'm detecting a sadness. I'm detecting, I wouldn't call it despondency, but almost like a sense of unhappiness out there. It's a weird one, this one, but it's like no one seems to be. Well, I'm okay, and people that are like in the tribes, we're all right because we kind of understand the world a bit better. But around me, I'm seeing a lot of sadness. Not particular reasons. I'm feeling it in their speech. I'm seeing it in their body language. And if this is an ongoing thing as part of the transubstantiation, I don't know, because I don't know who was and who wasn't when I was talking to them or dealing with them. But I can tell you for a fact, what I'm seeing at the moment is a big, huge collective sigh. And that's the psychic weather this week.
Wonder if that's just the despondency of the general zeitgeist, or everything's just so doom and gloom and the weather's cold. I mean, last year we were all going to boil to death, and this year it's bloody freezing.
I also think a lot of them are like my friends I was talking to the weekend, and they were also saying that the people they know that were transubstantiated are going, I wish I didn't do that. It could be part of that.
Yeah, they might be feeling a bit violated, but
Or
can't
just
understand it.
and worried and worried. The cognitive dissonance only lasts for so long.
Yeah, could be feeling violated and not understand why, or just serious regret.
Yeah. And now we come to the part of the show where Sarah and I look at books that have greatly influenced us, both in our spiritual growth, our interest in Fortean stuff, magic, psychic health, looking at the world. And it's the book review section. And I'll be going first this week because this is Beyond Room 313. And the book I picked, well, you always hear me talk about it, The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie. The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. Essentially, it is a historical book, but it has more to it than just history, because it makes you realize that there's a spiritual war upon humanity, particularly paganism. Now, Catherine Nixie is a Oxford scholar, and when the book was released, it fell into two categories, really. People like me who said, finally, this is the book that should have been written about the true history of how Christianity came to take over the Roman Empire and destroy the old pagan world with all the brutality and everything else. And also, it was a kind of a magical book in the sense that it opens up with the destruction of the Temple of Palmyra, the Temple of Athena in Palmyra in Syria, by Christians who wandered out the desert. And just before the book was released, it was destroyed by the Taliban, the other half of the Abrahamic grouping. And the book, it contains, if you're a pagan-minded individual, the book contains all the things. While it makes you angry, it also makes you feel at the same time triumphant that even with the destruction, there was once 140 million pagans in Europe. Today, there are none, almost handful pockets, but in an official sense, that's what they used to be. They were all wiped out by the Christians and the Muslims, and converted, or usually. But you realize that all the holidays and all the feast days that we have today, and so much of what they called mainstream Christianity, is pagan. So we survived. We survived the onslaught, and we're still here. The book is very well written, very accessible, very readable, and very human, like the stories about how a Roman governor was trying to get a Christian mother to explain to her son that he had insulted the emperor, and he said all he has to do is to say he's sorry and the kid will be okay and we won't harm you. And the mother was saying things like, no, I want my son to die so he'll go to heaven. And the frustration of the Roman governor trying to come to terms with why someone would want their own son dead to get into heaven. And it's very human in that sense. When the book came out, it was attacked, not surprisingly, by Christians, but it was also attacked by atheists. And this tells you two things: that one, atheism is just another branch of the Abrahamic, world. And secondly, they don't like any challenge to orthodoxy. And that's what makes The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie a Fortean book, because it was the first one of a popular publication to challenge the orthodoxy of the historical record surrounding the transitional period between the end of the old pagan Roman Empire and the beginning of the Christian Empire, mainly in the period following the Edict of Milan. So this is Forteana too, the re-examining of history. And it did get called conspiracy theory and stuff like that by certain Christian groups, but it doesn't matter because all the documents there are back it up, often from Christian sources, I might add, boasting about how they destroyed pagan temples and murdered priests and so on. So, Hypatia's memory lives on with us. And these people who came out dressed in black, who wandered out the Syrian desert with hammers and knives to create the one true religion of peace, well, they didn't succeed. So it's a very heartwarming book in that sense, as angry as it does make you. So that's my selection this week.
I remember listening to that book when Melanie read it on YouTube, and I really enjoyed it. despite the fact that there were moments when I was quite frustrated and found myself getting quite angry with what I was hearing, you know, the persecution and things that was in there. But it is a very, very, very interesting book.
Yeah.
Okay, my book this week is Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and I've picked a fictional book this week. And it's a novel that's become a classic of the horror genre since its publication in 1959. And the novel is a masterpiece of psychological horror, which is one of my favourite genres. And it explores the themes of isolation and fear and the supernatural. And the story follows a group of 4 individuals who come to Hill House, which is a mansion that's rumoured to be haunted. And they go there to investigate the paranormal phenomena that's been reported there. And the house itself is a character in the novel with its architecture and history, creating an atmosphere of dread and unease. As the group begins to explore the house, they start to experience unexplainable occurrences, and their relationships with one another become more and more strained. And what I like about the story is its focus on this psychological terror. The characters' inner thoughts and emotions are used to create a sense of dread that lingers long after the final page is turned. And the novel is not about jump scares or gore and blood, but rather it's about terror that comes from the unknown and the unseen. Eleanor, the novel's protagonist, is particularly compelling as she struggles with her own sense of identity and belonging in the world. And overall, I think The Haunting of Hill House is a classic of the horror genre, and it deserves its reputation as a masterpiece of psychological horror. And the film is very good as well.
I was just going to say that's the first time we've reviewed a book and also have done the film version. How does the book compare to the film?
Better, because you get inside people's thoughts in the book. You don't get that in the film. So it goes a little bit deeper into what's going on psychologically in people's heads.
Great.
So I'd just like to say thank you so much for tuning in tonight. We hope you've enjoyed watching it as much as we've enjoyed creating it. Before we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to express my gratitude. Firstly, a big thank you to all of you who've subscribed to both our channels. Your support means the world to us, and it's what keeps us going. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you'll never miss a new video. I'd also like to thank everyone who's liked and shared our videos, because your engagement helps us reach a wider audience and bring more value to more people. So if you haven't done so yet, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family.
And I will just say thanks again for everybody. And reiterate what Sarah said. Thanks for being here, and thanks for taking us forward into the future. And as usual, we close up tonight with the tarot. What's the card this week, Sarah?
This week we have the 8 of Swords, which goes well with last week's 10 of Swords. Anyway, the suit of Swords is connected to the mind, specifically the intellect, beliefs and expectations. And the 8 of Swords depicts a woman who seems disempowered and blindfolded, surrounded by swords, which suggests a feeling of being trapped or restricted. However, upon a closer look of the card, we can see that the woman is only loosely tied up, indicating that she can easily remove that blindfold and see that she can free herself from her own constraints. In the general sense, this card serves as a reminder that our minds often trick us into feeling trapped or disempowered, even when we have the power to change our circumstances. The blindfold symbolizes the limitations that we place on ourselves through beliefs and ways of thinking. It suggests that we must learn to recognize and challenge these limitations if we want to move forward in life. And the presence of water on the ground is also significant in this card. It represents intuition. And this tarot card is encouraging us to trust our intuition and listen to our inner voice rather than relying solely on our intellect. Balancing these two aspects of ourselves can help us find the way out of the self-inflicted prisons and limitations that we put ourselves in. This balance between using the intellect and the intuition is very important, and that's why water can be seen depicted on most of the cards within this suit. The Eight of Swords is a card of empowerment, reminding us that we have the power to break free from our mental and emotional barriers. We must learn to recognize the movies that we make in our minds and challenge them to find a way forward. There's always another way if you look.
Very much a female card, women trapped in relationships, bad jobs, bad situations, ruminating about things they'll never be able to change, blaming people now for things that they didn't do with other people in the past did it, holding on to grudges and putting them against people that didn't really do it. The path out is there if you walk out between the gap in the swords. And when a man gets it, it's basically you're doing this to the woman probably, and you're probably holding her in a gilded cage, and it's not really good for her as a person. But it generally is a female card. It's also one that you can use in magic rituals as well. It has the one like the Ten of Swords last week, and so that's definitely a woman card. I often wonder about the significance of the red dress. You think of the color red on a woman like that as its sensuality and eroticism, and maybe she's not being expressing of her feminine erotic nature, something like that. But yeah, artistically it's a very good card. I think there's a tower in the distance and a hill, isn't there? Distance that also makes you think of Rapunzel in the tower. So Rapunzel has left the tower, but she's still psychologically in the tower. So it's a good one for the rumination thing. So thanks very much for that, Sarah, and good night, everybody. And we'll see you next week on Sarah Mondaini's channel on YouTube. Thanks very much, and love yous all.
Good night.